Tonight we drift into the gentlest version of Sleeping Beauty. A candle glows, curtains hush, somewhere a cradle breathes. We will follow a wish, a curse, and a century of quiet until morning opens like a flower. Close your eyes. Let the story carry you. Softly, safely, slowly, we wander. Part 1, A Kingdom of Longing. Before the story wore a crown, before it learned the language of lullabies, there was only a wish. It lived in the high windows of a castle where the moon liked to linger, and in the soft, private prayer of a queen whose arms stayed empty. The corridors were long and beautiful, made of stone that remembered snow and summers and the weight of history. The king walked them at night, counting his steps, listening for a sound that never came, a tiny breath, a small cry, the proof that hope had a heartbeat. The queen sat by the eastern balcony with her hands folded over a ribbon that had no owner yet. She would close her eyes and imagine the small hand wrapping around her finger, light as a sparrow. She would imagine a laugh echoing through canopies and courtyards, a laugh bright enough to cut through any storm. When morning came, she would rise, composed and kind, and manage the daylight. But night belonged to longing, and longing is the oldest story shape. The kingdom loved their rulers. They did not whisper cruelty. Instead, they left flowers on the palace steps and tied prayers into the willow trees by the river. On feast days, they sent lanterns to the sky. Some rose steadily, and some spun a little in the wind, but all carried the same message. May joy find its way here. In the markets, in bread lines, in stables and classrooms, people spoke of the someday child in soft tones, as if speaking too loudly might scare a shy miracle back into hiding. The king rode to the outer chapels and placed candles where the air smelled of pine and patience. He stayed until the wax became puddles and the wicks were just small lights fighting a large dark. Then he would return to the castle with a calm face and tired eyes, and the guards would pretend not to notice the way he paused at the nursery door that had never been opened. Time, the old seamstress, kept stitching days together. Winters wrapped the hills in white. Springs unrolled their carpets of green. In summer, the river slowed enough that you could watch dragonflies correct their course and see the sky mirrored with a stubborn kind of faith. Autumn brought gold and copper leaves that piled like treasure in the palace gardens. Through it all, the queen kept a small wooden box at her bedside. Inside was a sprig of lavender, a smooth river stone, and a folded scrap of blue silk, tiny keepsakes for a life not yet begun. In every fairy tale, a door appears. Sometimes it is a real door, heavy and iron-bound. Sometimes it is a thought that will not go away, a hunger that wakes you up before dawn. For the queen, the door took the shape of a simple choice to ask for help beyond the borders of the ordinary. Messengers rode into forests and over pale mountains to invite wise women and old magic to the palace, not as a demand, as an invitation, tender and sincere. Come if you wish. There is an empty cradle here and a hope we cannot bear alone. They came quietly, as such guests do, with shoes that did not echo and eyes that had seen many, many winters. Some were called fairies by those who liked neat names. Others were simply women who had learned the language of herbs and stars and the human heart. They brought feather-light bundles, strange maps, bowls of sweet milk, and strings of bells that only rang when you were not listening. They walked the palace with courteous feet and gave the queen not promises but presents, which is a kind of spell all its own. One night, while the king studied treaties and the guards watched the outer gates, the queen rose from her bed and went to the little chapel inside the palace gardens. The moon had drifted low, caught in the branches of a bare elm. She knelt, not because kneeling is required, but because her body needed a shape for its hope. If you come, she whispered to the empty cradle inside her mind, I promise you a world where kindness is practiced daily, like music scales, until it becomes a natural song. Whether time hurt her or the old magic did, whether the river changed its course or the stars blinked in assent, the answer began like all answers, almost invisibly. The queen slept without dreams and woke with morning's fragile light on her face and a feeling that did not have a name yet. She did not say anything at breakfast, only touched the blue ribbon at her wrist the way one touches a small secret to check if it is still there. Days later, the castle's windows bloomed with candles. Bells spoke in long lyrical sentences. The king could not keep his smile quiet. The queen's hands shook when she took the midwife's hands in hers. In the kitchens, flour dusted the air like first snow as bakers made bread enough for an entire city to feel full. Children ran in circles until their circles made dizzy flowers. The willow trees along the river heard the news and leaned in, curious. The announcement was simple and perfect, written in ink that shone a little when it dried. A child is coming. It felt like the kingdom itself exhaled. The queen stood at her balcony and counted swallows. 1, 2, 3, 4. She let the numbers stitch themselves into her nerves, soothing and steady. The king, who had practiced the art of keeping tears inside, let precisely one slide down his cheek and into his beard. It surprised him, the sweetness of it, the way it tasted like a promise finally keeping itself. Preparations became their own gentle festival. The nursery was aired, though it had never been used. Sun found the room easily and laid itself on the floor in golden rectangles that looked like quiet invitations. Artisans carved a crib from pear wood. They sanded it until it held a soft glow, then laid a branch of rosemary across it for remembrance and courage. Seamstresses stitched linen and lace, working by windows where the light understood their work. They spoke of names in a chorus of murmurs. Names like Dawn and Rose, and those older names that carry weather in them. There were practical things, too. The queen's walks shortened. The king's meetings did as well. The captain of the guard practiced smiling, so he would not look too fierce when he stood in the hall wearing his sword and his joy. The village schools drew pictures of stars and gave them to the palace. Farmers tied ribbons in the manes of their horses. Sailors on the river looked up from their ropes and found themselves whistling the small tunes their mothers had used to soothe them. When the time finally came, it came gently. No thunder, no omens, only the soft thunder of footsteps in corridors and the steadiness of a nurse's voice counting breaths. The king stood outside the door, humble as a student. The queen breathed, rested, breathed again. In the hush before first cry, the world paused, tipping toward a moment it had been building for since the first lantern was launched into the sky. Then there she was, small, warm, powerful in the way that only new life is powerful, bending the shape of every room she entered without trying. The queen looked at her daughter and saw all the seasons queue up inside that tiny face. Snowlight, seed time, heather and harvest. The king looked and forgot every ledger he had ever signed. In the courtyard, a wind moved through the flags as if they were lungs. The bells did not ring right away. They waited, listening, their old bronze hearts learning a new rhythm. Then they spoke, a shining, many-voiced announcement that rose over streets and fields and riverbanks. She is here. Night fell softly that day, as if the sky said its own lullaby. The queen slept with her child on her chest and dreamed of apple blossoms. The king walked once more through the long corridors, but now his steps were counted not by sorrow, but by gratitude. The cradle did not stand empty anymore. The wish had come home. Part 2. The birth of Aurora. They named her for light, because light had been the prayer and the promise. In one telling, she is Aurora, the very edge of morning where colors try on the day. In another, she is briar rose, the brave bloom that dares the thorn. Either way, the name sits on her like a small crown woven of sun and story. The announcement traveled faster than geese, faster than gossip. It arrived as laughter where fields were being watered. It arrived as quiet gratitude in the small house of a weaver who had always looked toward the palace when she prayed. It arrived as a song on a boat where a mother rocked her child and thought of the queen. Two women joined by the soft, ancient work of keeping breath steady. The palace unfurled celebration with a practiced grace. Invitations were written by hands that had learned to spell joy without shaking. The script curved like vines. The ink dried to a deep, warm brown. Messengers went out, cloaks bright, riding different roads so that good news would enter the city by many doors at once. The crier in the square, who liked to shout a little even when he did not need to, kept his voice low for this. "You are invited," he said, and the words felt like bread. The hall chosen for the celebration had a ceiling like a night sky, carved and painted with constellations that nobody fully agreed on but everybody loved. Along the walls, tapestries told the history of the land in threads the color of wheat and river and storm. The floor was a dance. The sun would dance all day, crossing windows, laying paths of gold that children would follow with their fingers later, tracing the patterns as if they were maps to secret places. In the kitchens, the world turned to cinnamon and butter. Berries arrived in baskets that had learned patience in the fields. Cream stood waiting in bowls where even the moon would have seen herself and been pleased. The head cook, who prided herself on exactly measured kindness, invented a new pastry for the day, a spiral of sweetness whose layers spoke of time and surprise. She named it dawn bread. People ate it with their eyes closed, not out of greed, but because sometimes joy is best met with reverence. Musicians tuned their instruments until the very air hummed with readiness. Harps tested whispers. Flutes tried laughter in 3 keys, then chose the middle one. Drums made soft assurances while nobody was looking. In a corner, a violinist practiced the smallest note he could play that still carried feeling, then hid that note in the last song of the night for those who would be listening closely. The baby slept, supervised by a nurse whose hands had learned their gentleness from years of setting feathers back into pillows. The queen watched from a chair by the window, the child's tiny feet like punctuation marks to a sentence that would go on and on. The king hovered and then pretended not to hover, learning the choreography of new fatherhood. Approach, smile, retreat, return. Outside, lanterns were being raised one by one, the city making a necklace of light for its newest jewel. There is a custom in old stories that certain guests must be invited, not only because they bring gifts, but because not inviting them invites a kind of trouble. The list was made with care. The wise women who had walked the palace while hope was still a silent room were placed near the front. Their chairs were cushioned. Their names were written without a single ink blot. The steward checked everything twice and then again because some mistakes are louder than storms, and he had no desire to learn their language. Morning arrived honey-colored and steady. The procession from chapel to hall moved like a slow river. The princess, swaddled and serene, greeted her kingdom in the way of newborns by sleeping through applause. She wore a cap so finely knit that it looked like soft weather. The queen, walking with that new balance that motherhood grants, looked at everyone as if they were relatives she was glad to see. The king tried to keep his shoulders from looking like hills, failed, and gave up, choosing joy over posture. Speeches were short and true. Blessings were spoken by candle and by sunlight. A chorus of school children sang a melody so simple that even those who did not know it found themselves humming along before it ended. Servants carried platters with a grace that made them seem like dancers. The chandeliers held their breath and glittered. Then the moment came when the invited wise ones would step forward, each to offer a gift that cannot be wrapped. They did not rush. Each approached as if going to a well, bringing her own rope and bucket, knowing that what she drew up would be used for a very long time. The first, a woman whose hair had long ago made peace with the silver, placed a fingertip on the child's brow and gave her a nature that leaned toward kindness, the way vines lean toward trellis. Not a forced sweetness, but the kind that notices and mends and remembers names. The second, who smelled faintly of lavender and library dust, gave her delight in learning. Not merely facts, but the delicious how of them, the way a river makes a bend because the land asked it to, or because it insisted. The third offered music, not only in voice but in the ear, so that the princess would hear the harmony between creek and wind and the wool of sheep brushing the gate. Another bestowed courage measured to heart rather than to battlefields. The courage to say, "I am sorry," and the courage to say, "I forgive you." One gave patience, the kind that lets bread rise and friendships grow. Another gave humor, gentle and bright, so that shadows would not always have the last word in difficult rooms. A small, bird-boned elder, whose eyes were the kind of blue that has watched long distances, gave the princess the gift of wonder that does not wear out. With each gift, the hall felt itself growing larger, not in size but in depth, as if more story had been added to the space. The queen watched, a quiet sea of gratitude. The king held one edge of the cradle and found himself thinking of his own father and his father's hands, and the ways love travels down a line, even when the words along that line sometimes falter. Somewhere, at the far edge of the invitation list, where every name had been checked and inked and sealed, a silence stood up. It had arrived without trumpet or horse. It had been watching windows instead of doors. No one noticed it at first, because feasts have their own weather, and because joy is a little blinding. But stories remember what people forget. There was a guest who had not been counted among the expected, and the shape of her arrival was the shape of a hinge upon which the tale would soon turn. Part 3. The Banquet of Blessings. The hall was a lake of light when the last of the gentle gifts was placed like a star over the cradle. Laughter thinned into contentment. Servants refilled cups with a quiet that spoke of practice and pride. The musicians slid into a melody that felt like warm bread. The air was so full of good that it thought it might never be anything else. Then, like a cloud that forgets it is only a cloud and decides briefly to be a mountain, the room darkened. Not total blackness. Those belonged to other stories. But a hush that made candle flames think about staying very still. The great doors did not slam. They opened. A figure stood there in garments that drank light rather than reflecting it, a staff in one hand that tapped once upon the threshold, as if asking the hall to remember its own edges. Some said she was a fairy who lived in the long grass of forgotten invitations. Some said she was a grievance given flesh. Some said she was simply a woman who had grown tired of being left out and had let that tiredness become a kind of spell. Her face held beauty that had never been taught to smile. When she looked at the cradle, it was not with hatred exactly, but with an old hunger to be seen, the ache that lives in the shadow of everyone else's celebration. The steward, poor man, went pale enough to be mistaken for a candle. The king stepped forward with courtesy so sharp it could have been a sword if needed. The queen inclined her head a fraction, which is how grace behaves in the face of the storm. "You were not expected," she said softly, leaving the space for an apology to be placed in that sentence, if the visitor wished to place one there. "I was not invited," the woman answered, voice like a river in winter, still moving but beneath a crust you could not trust. Around the hall, eyes flicked to the steward, to the lists, to the place where responsibility always sits, trying to behave as if it is smaller than it is. The steward bowed until his backbone felt like a bowstring. An oversight, he managed. A sorrowful oversight. The woman crossed the threshold with a step that wrote its own law. Whoever she was, whatever she carried, she did not come to beg. She came to balance a scale in the way she understood scales. "Oversights have consequences," she said, not loudly. "But the word consequences is a bell even when whispered." She drew close to the cradle. The other wise ones stood, ready to become a wall if needed, their hands discreetly finding one another like vines forming a lattice. The queen did not move, because moving would have been fear, and fear is a teacher she did not want instructing the room. "Child name for morning," said the stranger. "You will find your dusk sooner than you should." A murmur rose and flattened, the way grass does beneath sudden wind. "On the day your youth completes its circle," the woman continued, "you will meet a wheel that turns thread into thread's true fate. You will take what is offered. The kiss of iron will open a door no one will want opened. You will fall. You will never rise." Her staff touched the marble once. It made a sound like a cup set down in a room where someone is sleeping. The meaning of her words moved through the hall like cold ink dropped into clear water. There are moments when time refuses to be polite. It tries to run. The king took a breath that hurt. The queen closed her eyes, not to avoid what was happening, but to look directly at it in the only way she could, inwardly, where the tenderest strength lives. The invited wise ones, the ones who had given music and kindness and patience, stood, breath joined. Not death, one of them said, voice steady as she stepped forward. She was small, the kind of small that does not ask permission to occupy the center of a circle. You have named your curse. I will name my answer. The visitor stared, cool winter, acknowledging cool winter. Answer then, she said, as if curious which language courage would choose. Not death, repeated the elder fairy. Sleep. If iron kisses skin, if destiny insists on its choreography, let it be a sleep so profound that no sorrow can cross it. Let it be a rest that keeps the body perfect and the spirit near. Let it last until the right moment finds its way here. The curse-bearer considered this the way a mathematician considers a new number, turning it around, checking its angles, tasting its logic. She nodded once, an acknowledgement that did not make her kind, but did make her exact. So be it, she said. I have no interest in argument when ritual will do. The door will open. She will fall, but she will not break. When the moment is correct, when the pattern requires its other half, something will wake her. She lifted her staff, smiled a small smile that did not improve her face, and added almost idly, I will not stay for cake. She left as she had come, without ceremony. The door closed behind her with a courtesy it had not shown to anyone else, as if even the wood understood that this was not a hinge to be rattled. The hall breathed again. Color returned to faces. A footman realized his hands were shaking and set down his tray before they turned celebration into accident. The queen stepped to the cradle then, pressing her lips to the place where a crown might one day rest, and spoke in a voice that would be the soft weather of her daughter's life. You are loved. It is the first and last line of every true spell. The king stood behind her and placed his hand over both of theirs, making a small architecture, a protection that might not stop fate but would teach it manners. Councils were called, not loud councils. Rooms were chosen where sound behaved. The captain of the guard explained wheels and spindles to people who had never touched them. His hands drew circles in the air. Spinning wheels had kept the kingdom clothed for centuries. To ban them was to unmake a kind of breathing. And yet what else to do? Decrees were drafted in language that did not pretend to be happier than it was. The words were necessary and did not try to be anything else. Remove the wheels, quiet the rooms, burn the splinters, hide the irons. Messengers rode again, not with ribbons on their cloaks this time, but with the careful urgency of those who know that each hour has an opinion. Spinners cried and laughed in the same breath, some at the relief of a royal concern for the child, some at the fear of empty looms. The palace promised cloth to compensate for cloth that would not be made. Warehouses opened their doors. Neighbors learned to share more than stories. Inside the castle, care took a new shape. The nurse checked corners the way owls check fields. The wise ones taught the queen how to recognize the metal hum of certain machines and how to hear the difference between danger and melancholy. Aurora, or Briar Rose, slept and fed and made fistfuls of air while everyone built a hedge of attention around her that had nothing to do with thorns and everything to do with love. Music returned, quieter at first, like a bird testing a caller after a long winter. The head cook made the cake. The uninvited guest had declined and served it on blue plates with gold edges. People ate it and closed their eyes, letting sweetness be sweetness. The musicians played that hidden note in the last song, the tiny sound the violinist had prepared, and a few listeners, those who tend to notice, felt something in their chests answer back. It is the way of stories that a blessing laid beside a curse makes a third thing, a path. The kingdom began to walk it. They did not walk perfectly. Some days, fear put a hand on their shoulders and asked for a dance. Some nights, the queen woke and touched the cradle to assure herself that sleep was only sleep. The king wrote laws and then rewrote them gentler. The staff learned to carry joy in one hand and vigilance in the other. The candles learned to burn with soft bravery. And somewhere, in the far architecture of what will be, a tower waited. It kept its winding stair and a window that collected dust like snow. It did not gloat. It did not plan. Towers do not plan. They stand. But a wheel would one day hum in one of its rooms, summoned by the gravity of a spoken fate. And a girl would go there because gates and warnings are only half the story. The other half is wondering. The other half is the tug of a thread you cannot see but can feel. For now, though, the hall slowly opened its hands and let the day continue. The guests kissed the air near each other's cheeks. The steward found his backbone again and wrote himself a private reminder in tidy script. Never underestimate the power of an apology offered on time. The queen sat. The princess drowsed. The sun slid across the floor in its golden way, and the musicians chose a gentle tune that turned the room back into a lullaby. Outside, the river said what rivers always say when they pass palaces and cottages alike. We are moving. Come rest by us. Everything goes on. The curse. The hall kept breathing after the stranger left, but it breathed as if it had learned something difficult. Candles were candles again, not witnesses. Laughter returned thinner like a river at the end of summer. The queen asked for the music to continue, and it did. Soft, because the body needs to remember ordinary motion even when the heart has heard a prophecy. That night, rooms filled with quiet industry. Couriers in plain cloaks were sent to every village. Scribes wrote by lamplight with steady hands, wording the decree without panic. Spinning wheels must be surrendered or dismantled, iron points blunted, spindles kept out of reach of curious hands. The king added a line that mattered to him. Compensation will be fair and timely. He underlined fair. He had learned what neglect can invite. Dawn found the city already awake. Carpenters stacked wheels outside their shops. Grandmothers carried wrapped spindles under their arms the way one carries a sleeping cat. The castle opened its storerooms and gave out cloth measured in lengths that felt like generosity, not charity. Weavers looked at their empty corners and then at their neighbors and said, "The only true thing about such days, we will figure it out." In the palace, the wise ones did not sleep. They sat with the queen and king at a long table, where maps were sometimes spread, and instead spread something else, a chronology of care. They marked the princesses' birthdays with symbols that were not crowns, but small leaves. "This is a growing," one said, tapping year 8. "This is a threshold," said another, tapping 16. "We will braid the years with attention," said a third. And the way she said braid made everyone think of hands working together. The baby, a syllable of warmth in a universe of marble and decree, slept. The nurse, whose wrists were a geography of old kindnesses, kept time by breathing with her. When the child woke, she blinked, unfussed, and found the queen's eyes immediately there, a mirror that would never shatter. At first, the curse lived like weather on the horizon, felt, discussed, respected. The palace practiced as if it had already survived it. Lessons were designed so that curiosity could be fed without sending a child up a forbidden staircase. The princess's toys were wooden animals, hammered dulcimers, a box of smooth stones from different rivers. When small hands reached toward anything sharp, gentle voices said, "Not that." When small ears tilted toward any secret, stories were offered so that wonder never had to hunt alone. But the curse had been spoken in public. It belonged to the kingdom now. It traveled in bakeries and over washboards, in prayer and in gossip. There were people who feared it until fear became a habit. There were people who did not respect it at all and made jokes that died in their mouths when they saw the queen pass. Most people carried it like a folded letter inside their coat, remembering it at thresholds and overlooking it during sunsets. The king visited workshops to thank people in person for the wheels they had surrendered. In one, he found a girl about 10, hands red from scrubbing, staring at the empty space where the wheel had stood. "What will we do?" she asked nobody in particular. He crouched. "We will do without," he said, "and together." and he meant both parts. He returned to the palace with a new certainty that ruling was bone work, not only gold work. The uninvited guest did not return. The wise ones did not pretend she would. They taught the queen small magics that are not called magic in the old texts. How to listen for a nail's song in the wall, how to sense when a room holds a stranger thought, how to touch the top of a sleeping child's head and leave calm behind like a candle left lit. On a day when clouds arranged themselves like pages, the palace took an additional step. It was not enough to remove wheels. Rooms had corners, and corners were good at secrets. "Hide her," said the smallest wise one, not as a command but as an understanding. Not because we distrust the world, but because we have promised the world our best chance to heal itself. The decision came slowly, but then all at once. A cottage already existed at the edge of a forest that wore birds the way summer wears laughter. It belonged to the crown and to nobody. It had a hearth capable of plain miracles. Stew from little, warmth from less. "We will go with her," said three of the wise ones, their voices fitting together like planked wood, as aunts, as hands, as weather around weather. The king swallowed a grief that respected what it swallowed. The queen held her daughter and breathed all the way down to the soles of her feet before she let go. "We are only ever letting go," she told herself, "and we are only ever holding on." The princess, blinking, traced the queen's necklace chain with her finger and then fell asleep, practicing the skill that would one day define an era. They left at dawn, cloaks the color of places birds trust. The road did what roads do, went on. Behind them, the castle kept standing. Ahead, the forest kept being a forest. The city watched with the good manners of a people who know that staring does not help. Some wept, some prayed. One child, too young to know what was being risked, waved a ridiculous hat, and the queen laughed despite herself, which saved her for the next 5 minutes, and then the 5 after that. When they reached the cottage, the gates squeaked as all honest gates must. Inside, the rooms were small and ready. The three wise ones, no longer robed, now aproned, set the princess's cradle by the window that lent itself to lullabies. They looked like women who knew where everything went, and put it there without fanfare. One hung a pot on a hook and nodded. One swept a floor that did not need sweeping because it made the sound of home. One lit a fire and let it learn the shape of the grate. Back at the palace, the rooms exhaled. The king and queen learned the grammar of distance. Letters, couriers, old paths that let news walk quietly through trees. Each month, a basket returned from the cottage with something that had only one sender. A pressed flower in winter, a perfect round stone in spring, a feather in summer, an oak leaf in fall. The queen kept them in her wooden box and altered to waiting. The curse had been softened, not erased, but the kingdom discovered something about itself it would never have learned otherwise. How to be careful without becoming cruel, how to stay awake to possibility without staying awake all night. Part 5, The Hidden Years. The cottage, called her Briar Rose, was not a disguise so much as a nickname, a truth with dirt under its nails. She grew the way trees grow when no one takes their picture, upright, patient, inventing small games that required nothing but air and attention. The three ants turned their magic down to a simmer. No sparks from air, no broom that swept itself. Secrets are loud when they are lazy. Mornings were simple. Fetch water, feed the chickens, wake the fire if sleep clung to its coals. One ant hummed work into being, notes accurate as a plumb line. Another told stories while chopping vegetables, each slice a punctuation mark. The third taught the kind of arithmetic that lives in bread. How many handfuls of flour make enough? How many minutes for a rise? How to tell with your palm what the clock can't. Briar Rose learned the woods like a map too beautiful to fold. She knew the polite path and the honest one, where the violets hid in April, where the fox spared footprints, where the creek invented new opinions after rain. She talked to birds with the seriousness children bring to their best ideas. She listened to wind that knew the palace by its old name and still called it that. The ants let her wander because wandering is a form of study, and called her back with a whistle that arrived in her ear as if it had been there since morning. Birthdays in the cottage were made of berries, not trumpets. The aunts wrapped small presents in clean cloth, a wooden comb with one tooth slightly stubborn, a ribbon not quite the color of any flower, a book with more margins than words so that notes would have somewhere soft to land. On one birthday, a hen laid an egg as if it, too, had understood the date. Everyone applauded the hen, who accepted the applause stiffly, as hens will. There were rules, but they wore comfortable shoes. Don't climb the north elm. The high branches are brittle. Don't put your hand too close to a pot's lip. The steam will gladly teach you humility. Don't follow a path simply because it is the path. Ask first which story it tells. And the one rule that was not spoken every day but floated through all days like a low note in a song: never touch a spindle. When Briar Rose asked what a spindle was, an ant held up a twig and said, "A danger shaped like nothing at all." And the child accepted this, as children do, placing the mystery on a shelf and decorating it with daisies. Sometimes the princess, without knowing it was a princess she was, felt the world tilt toward a place she could not see. She would pause in the doorway, fingers still dusty with flour, and the cottage would feel for an instant like a room 2 rooms wide. An ant would look up then, as if hearing a language she had vowed not to speak, and say, "Come help me with this," and the moment would pass. Seasons did their old work. Winter's breath made the window panes draw their frost ferns. Spring unrolled green in shades the eye can never remember all at once. Summer taught the creek to speak confidently. Autumn let go of what it had been holding with grace. Briar Rose grew taller. Her hair learned sun. Her hands learned callous. Her eyes learned that people carry weather inside and that some need an umbrella more than a lecture. She met the forest's other tenants with care, a deer that was not shy, a fox that laughed once, which foxes do sometimes if you have never heard it and don't expect it, an old woman who collected mushrooms like a scholar, teaching her the difference between food and regrets, a charcoal burner with a back like a question mark who knew every bird by its first name, a boy who knit fishing nets and tried, mostly successfully, not to be startled by the kindness in her voice. The aunts were not perfect. They bickered in the kind of way that lets love stretch its legs. One preferred recipes by weight. One preferred recipes by memory. One claimed recipes were an insult to improvisation. They argued about the best way to cut kindling, then laughed at themselves when they realized they were arguing about being warm. They forgot to buy salt twice and remembered in the middle of the night when no shop was open. They cried on different afternoons for reasons they did not always share, and were forgiven without the reasons. Letters came rarely and were never read aloud, but Briar Rose knew when the mail had reached the cottage because the aunts became careful with their faces. One would put on a kettle she did not need. Another would sweep the same spot of floor until it shone. The third would stare at the sky as if reading what the birds refused to print. Briar Rose would sit by the doorway and hum to the doorway, which is how she comforted herself on days when rooms felt slightly larger than they should. Once, when she was 12 and felt both infinite and very small, an age with 2 clocks, she asked, "Do I have parents?" The room did not stop, but time walked in quietly. An ant set down a spoon. "Yes. Do they miss me?" Another ant smiled, and the smile had a seam she could feel with her fingertip. "Every day. Do I miss them?" The third ant set a hand on her hair. "Every day," she said, and that was the lesson. In the forest, there was a tree with a scar that looked like a doorway. She visited it when weather inside her needed an open window. She pressed her forehead to the bark and told the tree about being 16 soon, how numbers can be thresholds you can't see until you are already past them. The tree listened the way trees listen, with rings. On the last night before her birthday, a number she did not know was important beyond the way numbers are important to cakes. She dreamed of towers without ladders and halls with sleep folded on chairs like shawls. She saw a wheel turning in a room that had forgotten sunlight. She reached out in the dream to stop the wheel, but her hand held a flower instead, and the flower did nothing to the wheel. She woke early, the kind of early that belongs to bakers and to worry. The aunts were already up, faces bright with a brightness that tried too hard not to be bright. They sang a little too loudly. They offered her a berry tart for breakfast, as if tarts were a morning food and always had been. Day trickled into noon. The forest smelled like green and hot stone. A path she had walked 100 times looked new, which is how fate dresses itself when it comes without knocking. "Stay close," an ant called from the doorway, voice perfectly calm in the way that tells you calm has been braided to fear. "I'm only going to the brook," Briar Rose answered, perfectly honest in the way that tells you a different brook will be found. She did not run. She followed a hum, not a song exactly, but the suggestion of one. If you have ever heard a train long before you saw it, you know the feeling. Something powerful is arguing with distance. The hum led to a track in the grass she had somehow never followed, and to a gate that had never been there, and to a tower that had always been waiting. Part 6. The Spindle's Fate. The tower rose from the earth as if the earth itself had wanted a finger to point at the sky. No banners, no guards. Stones the color of unsalted bread. A swallow's nest under the eave. The door was not locked. Old wood that trusted gravity more than bolts. Inside, the stairs curled like an idea you keep returning to. Dust made its own weather. Light fell through narrow windows and laid itself on each step, as if steps were pages and light was a careful reader. Briar Rose climbed. She did not know why. She did not feel compelled in any storybook way. Curiosity does not shout. It asks you, politely, to continue. Her hand brushed the wall. The wall held the day's cool in its palm and offered it. At the top, a door. At the door, a pause. She knocked, because she had been taught to knock. A voice from inside said, "Come in," the way old voices do when they are surprised and pleased to have company. And something else besides. The room held a window, a chair, a wheel, and an old woman whose hair was the color of decision. The wheel turned slowly, steady as a heart at rest. "What is that?" Briar Rose asked, and the room smiled, because rooms love honest questions. "Work," said the woman, as if there were no sweeter word. "May I try?" The old woman looked up sharply then, a small flinch as if remembering a script she had misplaced. The wheel kept turning. "You may look," she said finally, "and I will keep my hands on what needs hands." Briar Rose stepped closer. The wheel made a sound like a creek that had found its patience again after a flood. The spindle stood upright, quiet, a single shining point at the end of ordinary wood. "It is nothing," thought Briar Rose, relief blooming in her chest like a kind of pride. "It is no dragon. It is not even a knife." She reached for the thread to see how it behaved, how strong it was when new and how strong when older. "Careful," said the woman, a word too late to be offense. "There is a kind of moment that has no length at all. It happens between one breath and the next. It is the hinge on which a century can turn and still not creak." Her fingertip touched the spindle. The iron kissed skin with the smallest possible kiss. The old woman made a sound that had no name. The world folded. She did not fall hard because the curse had been softened by someone who loved softness. She lay down as if a bed had been placed under her. Her eyes closed as if night had just arrived over a meadow and the meadow had accepted it. Her breath went on, small, exact. A strand of hair drifted across her cheek as if to write something, and did not. The curse went out from the tower, not like lightning, which is greedy, but like dusk, which is thorough. It touched the cottage first. The three aunts sank into chairs with their aprons still on, faces turned toward the door as if to catch one more question and give it a good answer. The stew stopped just at simmer, a perfection it could never have held had the day been allowed to end. The chicken put its head under its wing and dreamed a grain into a field. It moved to the city. A blacksmith's hammer paused midair and stayed, as if cast in the very metal it had been shaping. A baker closed his eyes with flour at the corner of his mouth, a white promise held. A child fell asleep in the middle of a sentence and would, 100 years later, finish it without a seam. A ship on the river leaned into a curve and held the lean, the water whitening at its bow like permanent laughter. At the palace, the queen felt the floor tilt, not in fear, in recognition. She had been waiting for this moment since before the cradle was warmed. She stood. The king stood. Their hands found one another with the muscle memory of prayer. "May it be as gentle as breath," the queen said, and the wish went ahead of the wave as a shepherd goes ahead of the flock. The guards sat down where they stood, chins falling to chests with a neatness that would have made the captain proud if he had still been awake to judge posture. In the tower room, the old woman, who was not cruel, curses ride on whoever is nearby, the way storms drench roofs that never asked for rain, set the distaff aside with deliberate care, and folded the princess's hands over her heart. "Sleep," she said, which was nothing but the truth. She drew the curtain half across the window to keep the light reasonable, because light, too, can be a noise. Then she sank to the floor by the door and went to sleep with her hand near the latch, as if still being useful. The thorns began almost immediately. No one planted them. No one planned. The world, hearing that 100 years would be needed, did what the world does best when given time. It grew. Brambles braided themselves out of the ground's old plans. Roses climbed their new scaffolding with ambition and patience, building a wall woven from softness guarded by severity. Paths forgot themselves. Maps remembered and then let go. Birds nested in the first convenient places, and in the last inconvenient ones. Inside the sleep, the princess dreamed the way seeds dream beneath snow, not of what will be, but of what is kept safe until it is time. The kingdom lay in a single, steady breath. Dust did not settle. It only paused its deciding. Clocks held their hands just before and just after. Fire cooled to the memory of flame. Milk in a jug remained exactly as it was, catching a crescent of light that had nowhere better to be. Time, unhurried for once, examined its pockets. It found minutes from other people's lives who had not needed them and tucked them carefully into the next century. It stopped to look at the way a sunbeam fit through a keyhole and did not move on until it understood why it liked that so much. It learned the names of all the cats. It agreed to return everything it had borrowed. Outside the roses, rumors took root in the places rumors prefer. Hearth edges, field edges, the edge of a yawn where a long day meets its honest end. Travelers told travelers they had seen a wall of thorns that blinked, that sang, that reached for swords and changed them into harmless vines. Some swore they had found a path nearly through before the brambles rearranged their grammar and turned sentence into knot. "There is a castle," they said, "asleep. And what more needs saying to those who listens for stories, the way thirsty ground listens for rain?" In the cottage, the ant slept in the shapes of their usefulness, one with a spoon still in her hand, one with her palm resting on the table as if to steady a cup, one with her head tilted toward the door like a candle flame that has learned manners. In the palace, the king and queen slept side by side, not as rulers, but as people, which is how they had always hoped to be remembered. The nurse slept in a chair by a bed that had been slept in by someone else long ago. Sleep begets sleep, and none of it was wasted. High in the tower, the wheel stood idle. The spindle did not gleam. It simply was. A spider began a web in the window and did exquisite work, because there was time to do exquisite work. The princess's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that made the dust dance if you watched closely enough. Somewhere far away and very near, a future prince grew in the idea of the world the way stories grow, slowly, without hurry, as if time itself were knitting a path toward a door that had been closed with great care. No trumpet sounded, no prophecy announced a schedule. The roses kept doing what roses do, insisting on beauty even when guarded by thorn. The sleep kept doing what sleep does: repair, erase, rehearse, keep, protect. And the spell kept its one condition: plain as a candle on a table. When the right moment arrives, let morning return. Part 7. The Sleeping Kingdom. Sleep descended like evening settling on a meadow, slow, entire, and kind. It laid a hand on the tower room first, smoothing the princess's hair as if it were straightening her ribbon before a long journey. It moved across stair and stone, down through corridors where footsteps remembered their patterns and then forgot them with a grateful sigh. It reached the kitchens just as a loaf rose to its proudest height, preserving that moment forever. Bread held at perfection, warm as a promise kept. Guards folded into their chairs with the tidiness of men who liked neat endings. A page boy slumped against a tapestry that had taken 10 winters to weave, and the stag stitched there looked down and seemed to keep watch. In the nursery, dolls dozed, porcelain eyelids painted open, but somehow serene, as if they knew that play is only a rehearsal for tenderness. Lamps dimmed themselves to a thoughtful glow and then relinquished even that, holding their wicks like closed mouths. In the chapel, the priest's hand paused in the air, 2 inches above a blessing that would arrive a century later without having lost its way. Bees in the palace hives drifted into silence mid-figure 8, storing sunlight in their bodies like small libraries of gold. The cat in the queen's sitting room, independent, inscrutable, and only sometimes affectionate, stepped once, twice, and then settled with a sigh at the exact spot where the carpet stayed warm. Beyond the palace, sleep found the roads. Cartwheels stopped making their useful poetry. A woodcutter leaned his axe against a tree and, with a face like the end of a day, sat down. He would wake with sap in his nose and a story in his pocket. Blacksmiths rested with their tools still in their hands, as if they had clutched the handles all the way into another world. A seamstress's needle hovered above blue cloth, a bright comma waiting for its claws. Even the river slowed, learning, just for now, the art of holding itself. It did not stop. Water does not approve of stopping, but it remembered a lake it had known long ago and, for the length of a legend, behaved like one. Mirror still, patient, sure. Fish suspended among reeds, as if listening to a lullaby only they could hear. A heron, mid-step, kept its balance with impossible grace, 1 foot just above the skin of the water, as though poised to teach the future how to arrive without a splash. The city's market froze in its brightest hour. A seller of pears, mouth open to call a bargain, would finish the word in 100 years with equal enthusiasm. A girl, considering a cluster of ribbons, held the red one an inch from her hair. It would be there when she woke, and she would place it behind her ear and wear it down the street as if no pause had ever come between choice and action. On a windowsill, cooling pies became a story the crows would retell for generations. The time the stem turned to an idea and stayed that way. Inside the Royal Library, sleep laid its hand across open pages. Books remember, but they also rest. A scholar's quill stopped a heartbeat before blotting the paper. The ink in its nib remained fresh for a century, a midnight held in a needle's eye. On the desk, a drawn map of the western hills had 3 tiny dots of crumb, evidence of a hasty lunch, that would still be tender to the touch when the morning returned. Dust motes, mid-drift, felt no hurry to land. In the Queen's chamber, the bed welcomed 2 sleepers with the tenderness of furniture that has witnessed vows and arguments, letters written and torn, the learning of lullabies. The Queen's hand, palm inward, had been reaching for a bell rope to summon a nurse. It remained there, half-curled, a gesture that meant and would always mean care. The king lay beside her, his breath lining up with hers until the rhythms matched, 2 rivers agreeing on a confluence they had always intended. The 3 aunts in the cottage near the woods surrendered to their chairs as one might surrender to a hymn, willingly and without complaint. The oldest spectacles slid to the end of her nose and stayed ready to fall forever. The kettle's whistle had begun but never shrieked. Instead it wore the softest ring, a halo of sound held just above the ear. Outside, hens tucked heads beneath the wings. Foxes, mid-slink, became sculptures of velvet and intent. And as sleep settled on bodies and rooms and tools and air, the land, respectful, practical, rose to its part in the vow. Bramble found bramble and braided. Roses reached for any sturdy thing and then became the sturdy thing themselves. Vines wrote looping cursive across gate and wall, spelling a sentence the wind could read. Not yet. Birds, delighted by new architecture, built nests the way painters layer light. Twig, feather, the secret softness of lamb's wool stolen when backs were turned. From a distance, the castle became a hill of green with blush-petaled punctuation. Years have habits, the way people do. They like to walk in pairs, winter with firelight, summer with shade, spring with rain, autumn with the honest work of letting go. Those habits continued, polite as ever. Snow gentled the bramble and the rose. Rain stitched silver threads through thorns. Sun warmed what it could touch. The wall grew. It did not snarl. It did not threaten. It held, which is different and nobler. Not all who came to see it were foolish. Some arrived because stories pull at the hem of our days. They stood at a respectful distance and removed their hats. Mothers told children, "Love is patient," and felt for once the shape of the words while saying them. Travelers set down packs and ate bread with the deliberate gratitude of those who know that eating is a ceremony. Musicians tried a tune and stopped, and tried another and stopped, and then put away their instruments because silence had insisted on being the melody. And yet the sleeping kingdom did not become a shrine to sadness. Within the hedge, life kept its promise through rest. 1,000 small repairs were undertaken that no waking hour ever makes time for. Worn threads and courage were rewoven. Memories with sharp edges were sanded smooth. Promises that had wandered off returned to the table and sat down with their hands in their laps. In the barn, a foal born at the hour of sleep stood without trembling. In the conservatory, a pale orchid decided at last to unfurl. Somewhere in that vast, soft pause, a question kept no one awake and yet persisted. Who will arrive at the hour appointed, and who will be ready to welcome him? Part 8. 100 years of sleep. A century is long to the impatient and short to a mountain. It is exactly the right length for a spell that intends healing. Time, freed from errands, tried on its old ways again. It walked the long path over the ridge at dawn to see how the light came in, and then returned by dusk to discover how the dark softened corners. It remembered the names of the stars in winter, and taught them to a fox that listened from the mouth of its den for reasons it did not know. Seasons turned, not in circles but in braids. Springs arrived with wet knees and frogs full of announcements. Summers leaned against trees and let the bees write praise song on the air. Autumns balanced apples in their palms, then tipped their hands and let all that ripeness fall into baskets. Winters tucked quilts up to the edge of the hedge and told the stones to rest. Each year added ring to trunk, ring to trunk, ring to trunk. A quiet arithmetic that the woods understood without counting. Stories grew up around the roses like companion plants. One told of a hedge that moved at night, rearranging itself the way a sleeper finds the cool side of a pillow. Another swore that the thorns parted for birds who had learned a certain melody, and that the melody could be guessed if you listened at dawn while the mist still believed in itself. There was the tale of a peddler whose mule found a path almost to the gate before the mule, wiser than its master, lowered its head and turned back with a sigh that sounded like forgiveness. Children collected these stories, the way they collected smooth stones, arranging them on cottage steps in careful rows. Not everyone came with reverence. Youth is a kind of weather. It storms and clears and storms again. Knights set out with flags that looked well against sky. Squires followed with packs full of optimism and pork. They reached the hedge and found not a fight, but a patient refusal. Swords caught on nothing but green. Thorns bent away when they should have struck, then bent back when boots insisted on pushing through, turning a straight path into a maze and a maze into a circle, and a circle into a mirror that showed, finely and gently, a face learning humility. Here and there a bramble would seize a lance, not to harm, but to hold a conversation the knight had not expected to have. He would tug, and the bramble would keep the other end with that polite stubbornness roses excel at. The knight, face red, would tug again, and the bramble, face unreadable, would continue holding until the knight's squire said, "Sir," in a voice that contained a meadow of suggestion, and the knight would look up and realize afternoon had been replaced by evening. They would camp then, and morning would always bring clarity. Men wrote about the hedge later with elaborate adjectives, and then, in the last line, used a small, true word, merciful. Bards took the tale on the road, which is a bard's true address. In taverns with low ceilings and ale supposed to be colder than it was, They sang of a princess whose breath kept time with the moon, of a kingdom that chose to keep its manners even in sleep, and of a future that walked toward them sure-footed and unhurried. Verses multiplied as verses do, borrowing from the next town while forgetting a little of the previous one, until there were so many versions that none could claim to be the only one. The theme held, "Some doors only open when all the hinges agree." Nature, unobserved by those who think they notice everything, partnered in the keeping. Mice made winter apartments in abandoned helmets and wrote to cousins about the benefits of metal walls. Owls considered the hedge from above and learned its patterns until they could thread themselves through it with the precision of needles. Deer learned where the berries grew sweetest. Children learned where to never pick 'em. A bear used a grain store for a pleasant nap and left behind in spring an apology in the form of a trampled path she kept to thereafter, out of respect. The palace itself, stone bones, leaded glass eyes, rested and resting, remembered its earliest plans. Foundations soothed hairline complaints. Hinges stopped thinking of themselves as tired. The grand stair, relieved of diplomacy, straightened its back. Chandeliers held their crystals lightly and quietly, learning sunbeams by name. The Royal Conservatory, moist as a breath, turned itself into a book where ferns wrote the oldest sentences. Violets made a habit of appearing where no gardener would have thought to plant them. In the library, pages loosened their shoulders. Ink deepened, discovering even darker blues in its night. A pressed sprig inside a cookbook. Time, perhaps, dried from green to brown to a kind of music. A mouse nibbled the corner of a recipe for orchard tarts and reconsidered, deciding it had always preferred the poetry aisle. The great pendulum clock in the corridor stopped with its brass tongue lifted toward a word it had not yet said. For a century it stood like that, admirably patient, and later, when it began again, it did not rush the sentence. The king and queen kept vigil by not keeping vigil, by giving themselves entirely to the work sleep needed from them. They rested as an example. They rested as an act of trust. The princess slept exactly as one learns to when lullabies have been sincerely given, not too deep to lose the world, deep enough to stay safe from it. In her dreams, rooms had doors that always led back to gardens. In her dreams, a bird hopped along a windowsill and learned her name without anyone teaching it. Outside the hedge, children grew to adults and told their own children the tales they had been told. A boy who had stood on tiptoe to see the bramble above the hedge grew into a man who widened a path for his neighbor's cart. A girl who had pressed her ear to the wall of roses to hear if sleep made a sound grew into a woman who listened before she answered. The spell's lesson traveled farther than the thorn's shadow. Patience learned a few more tricks. Hope learned to keep quiet and still be mighty. And somewhere across a river and beyond 3 small hills, a child was born who would someday hear the story and not only admire it or fear it, but hear inside it his own name echoed. He would not know why at first. He would be good at trees, climbing them, sitting in them, watching storms from them. He would be a dutiful son and then a dutiful young man, which is the craft that steadies any later bravery. You could have watched him then and not known. You could have watched him always and known exactly. All the while, the 100 years set each bead on the string in order. First, then second, then 99th, then 100th. When the last knot was tied, the world stood very still, listening. It did not say ah, it did not applaud. It breathed in and held the breath, because in that held breath lived the path and the boots that must walk it. Part name, The Prince's Quest. He learned the tale the way most people do, as a bedtime story that felt too large to fit in a room and yet somehow did. His nurse told it with attention paid to kitchens, because she liked kitchens. His tutor told it with attention paid to maps, because he believed geography had a vote in destiny. The boy liked, most of all, the part where the roses did not wound for sport. He liked that they refused. Refusal seemed to him a holy word when used to protect what must be protected. He grew. Childhood wore its familiar jackets, summers full of scrapes and endless evenings, winters where the first frost visited his eyelashes and made him blink laughter. He learned to bow without sighing, to speak without gums of gold, to stay in a saddle as if born to it. He also learned to be quiet in forests, to tell the species of tree by the shade it cast, to make a fire that warmed and did not gossip smoke into the eyes of his friends. He visited villages and thought the plows beautiful. He visited his grandfather's old armory and thought the helmets lonely. When he was old enough to be responsible for promises, just old enough, which is the best time, he heard the story again from a traveler who had read 4 versions in 4 towns and kept the best line from each. A kingdom folded into quiet, a girl holding the morning under her eyelids, a wall of roses that understood time better than any priest. The prince did not feel a trumpet begin in his ribs or a banner unfurl in his spine. He felt rather a door open, somewhere he had always believed was solid wall. "Father," he said that afternoon, standing by the window where the light could do its good work on difficult conversations, "I would like to see the hedge they sing about." The king, practical, exact in affection, looked not at his son's face, but at his hands. Steady, no tremble, no fist. "You may," the king said, because he had been a son once and had not been allowed to go, and that had taught him 2 lessons. That he had survived, and that survival was not the same as living. "Take 3 men who will tell you the truth even when you do not like the flavor of it. Take bread enough to be generous. Take a map you will not need." He set out on a day that looked fair without swagger, a blue sky with the decency to include a cloud. His companions were men whose boots had been boots for a long time, who knew that a horse's mood matters more than its pedigree, who could read weather from the way birds flew low. They spoke little, not because they were severe, but because the road speaks, and one should not interrupt. Their second night out, a storm came that shook the tent ropes like bells. The prince lay awake and measured the distance between thunder and flash and decided that fear, often, is simply eagerness wearing a mask. On the morning of the 3rd day, they saw the first roses, not as a wall, but as a rumor in green. The hedge did not announce itself. It gathered. It thickened where hills folded into one another. It found stones and embraced them, found fallen branches and employed them, found fallen towers and crowned them. Birds went in and out like thoughts. Bees performed their golden speech without apology. They dismounted within respectful distance. The prince told the horses what good creatures they were and left them in the shade with water and apples, which horses do not require but accept with the politeness of saints. He walked forward and placed his palm on the outermost thorn. It turned its face aside a fraction, not flinching, but acknowledging the courtesy of a hand offered before a blade. He smiled and felt foolish for smiling at a plant, and smiled again because that is the best kind of foolishness. His men made a rope of themselves, one at his shoulder, one at his back, one a pace ahead, testing ground with the butt of his spear. They tried one fold of hedge and then another. Some gave, like librarians, making room on a shelf when a beloved book returns from a long absence. Some did not. Where the way tightened, the prince stepped where the ivy suggested. Where the way sighed with relief, he thanked no one in particular. Scratches marked his sleeves. A thorn took a button and kept it. He did not ask for it back. Now and then, the hedge rearranged its mind, closing the mouth of a tunnel they had not trusted anyway, opening an archway where there had been nothing but thorn. "It knows," said the man with the spear, surprised into speaking aloud. "It knows," the prince answered, not surprised at all. Once, in a green-lit chamber of leaves and air sweeter than any he had breathed, he stopped and pressed his ear to the bramble. He heard nothing but the soft litany of sap. He stood anyway, as if before a door, and said the only word that felt true, "Please." The hedge made no dramatic gesture. It shivered. It sighed, if sigh can be a plant's vocabulary. Ahead a path straightened. He went on. When they reached the first wall, he expected height to be the problem. It was patience. The shapes of towers rose under vines. Windows wore curtains of fern. He placed his hand against stone. The cool entered him up the arm and steadied him all the way through. "We are near," he said, as if something outside had asked, and the men nodded as if they had heard the question too. In the outer courtyard, sleep had made a museum of motion. A fountain, mid-sparkle, suggested that water can hold a note as perfectly as a choir if given enough time to practice. A dog dozed on its side in a postured dog's reserve for summer afternoons and absolute trust. A gardener lay with a trowel in his hand and dirt under his nails and dignity on his face. The prince bowed to him, deeply and without shame. "We're in their keeping," he whispered. And his voice did not echo, because echoes do not shout in sanctuaries. Through the great doors, heavy, obliging, grateful to be useful again, they entered the hall. It was at once grand and intimate. The chandeliers shimmered with the slightest breath of air, as if greeting old friends. The long table still held a bowl of apples that had not surrendered to time. One had a bruise no worse for its century of pause. A seam of sunlight lay across the floor like a ribbon. He stepped over it as one steps over a boundary drawn by a child, carefully, with respect for the serious play. He climbed the stairs that had seen generations measure themselves against their curve. He passed tapestries that knitted together hunts and harvests and the quiet victories of domestic life. In one woven scene, a woman held a child and a man held a bowl of soup, and both looked equally noble. He thought, as he climbed, that every story ought to remember soup and the hands that carry it. At the landing, silence grew even kinder. He felt it in his palm when he set it on the wooden newel. He felt it in his chest, where a heartbeat steadied, not from bravado, but from rightness. A small door stood slightly ajar, and there the air tasted of spun wool and old sunlight. He knocked. It was not required. He knocked because he had been well raised. No answer came, and all the answers came. In the tower room, he found her. Beauty is a word that must be carefully used. This was not beauty staged or sharpened. It was the kind light has when it enters a room and finds it as it had hoped to find it, quiet, ready, full of company. Her hands lay folded as if holding nothing and therefore everything. A strand of hair wrote a sentence near her temple and then changed its mind. Her lips were not redder than anything. They were the color of promise kept. He did not rush forward. He closed the door gently behind him, as if dust might be shy. He crossed the room with the slow certainty of someone finishing a long thought. He did not ask what to do. He did not look for an authority to obey. Love in this telling is not a thunderclap. It is an agreement. He leaned and he kissed her, not as a hero claims a prize, but as a pilgrim touches stone worn smooth by belief. The kiss was a key. It turned without squeal, without resistance. Her breath deepened. Her eyes moved beneath their lids. A swallow traveled her throat like the first small wind across a winter field. She opened her eyes. That is all. That is everything. For the length of one heartbeat, the world was only two people remembering that they had met before they were born. In the mind of a story, in the patience of a kingdom, in the good office of time. Below them, bells remembered their craft with delighted surprise. The fountain completed its arc. The droplet that had waited 100 years struck the basin and made a sound so pure a dozen birds tried to imitate it at once. The gardener sat up and scratched his chin and blinked twice and then looked pleased that he could go back to his bedwork. The cat stretched each leg as if inventing stretching and headed to the kitchen, where a saucer would be placed without anyone asking who had put it there. The hedge did not fall back in defeat. It bowed like a choir at the end of a song, then stood aside, still proud, still needed. Roses shook rainless drops from their petals. Paths remembered themselves with relief like names remembered in the doorway of an old friend's house. The prince's men, halfway down a hall and fully out of prayer, looked at one another and grinned and ran, because dignity sometimes needs to be reminded to make room for joy. In the tower, she sat up. Surprise did not conquer her. It introduced itself politely and took a seat in the corner. "Hello," she said, not because there was nothing else to say, but because hello carries inside it all possible next sentences. He bowed, not as one bows to a queen, not as one bows to a charm, but as one bows to a person fully awake. He offered his hand. She took it. That is how, in the gentlest version of any story, morning enters. Through a door, two people agree to hold open together. Part X, the awakening. Morning did not arrive all at once. It threaded itself through the castle like a ribbon, tying rooms back to their names. The first bell hesitated, perhaps embarrassed to begin after so long, then remembered its note and sang. The second joined, relieved. Sound returned the way birds return to a tree that has outlived a storm. Cautious, then confident, then everywhere. In the tower, she blinked and let the world come into focus at a kind pace. The prince stood near the window, not in triumph, only in presence, as if he had stepped into a story and found that the right role was simply to be kind. She sat up, the dream of a long winter peeling away like gentle light from snow. "Was it long?" she asked, voice low, as though not to wake the dust. "Long enough for everyone to be ready," he said. And the answer made sense to a heart taught by lullabies. They did not rush. She touched the back of the chair, the curve of the window, the grain of the door, greeting wood and air as if they were old friends who had kept a place for her. He watched without impatience. "May I walk with you?" he asked, which is a good beginning for almost anything. She nodded, and they went. On the stair, time stitched itself back together. The air held the faintest thread of spun wool, the faintest memory of perfume, the smallest sweetness of stale cake re-becoming fresh. A tapestry on the landing sighed as its woven stag finally leaped the woven brook. In the corridor below, the long pendulum clock lowered its brass tongue and finished the word it had been forming for a century. It said now, and the syllable fit. Servants woke without the startle that follows bad dreams. They opened their eyes as if the dark had politely excused itself. A footman straightened a tray he had balanced in sleep. A maid, hand still upon a windowsill, finished thinking the thought she had paused upon and smiled to discover she still liked it. In the library, the scholar lifted his quill and looked down at the page to find the ink had waited. A courtesy between friends. He wrote the next line with gratitude, and the line was better than the one he had planned. Outside, the roses took a breath you could almost hear, their thorns unhooked from 100 little stubbornnesses, and paths remembered themselves like names rediscovered at a doorway. The hedge did not fall in defeat. It bowed, then settled tall, guardian still, but with its hand no longer across the latch. Birds flurried and resettled. Bees told one another the news by dancing in small suns. Word moved through the city like a tide with bells in it. A pear seller finished his bargain, voice steady. A girl with a ribbon finally tucked it behind her ear and laughed at how well it suited her. The blacksmith's hammer came down with a ring that sounded like a promise kept. In kitchens, ovens exhaled. In barns, horses shook their manes and remembered their favorite buckets. A dog stretched and spoke 3 soft syllables to anyone who cared to know his private language for joy. The queen woke as if surfacing from a lake without cold. Her hand found the king's, exactly where she had left it. They looked at one another and saw all the years they had taught themselves patience, now leaning against the wall like tools after good work. "She is awake," the queen said, though nobody had told her. "Of course," said the king, as if the sentence had waited all its life to be true. They dressed without ceremony. Joy has no need for medals. On their way through the corridors, they greeted those they met, not like rulers performing largesse, but like parents walking through a house that had learned to breathe again. They entered the stairwell just as Aurora came down, the prince a step behind, neither leading nor following exactly. For a heartbeat, the world returned to its stillness so that the moment could hear itself. Some reunions are loud, some are full of words. This one was neither. The queen gathered her daughter as one gathers a beloved story and rested her forehead against hers. "You slept well," she whispered, which was true. The king held them both in an embrace that made a small shelter in the long hall. "Welcome back," he said, as if she had only gone to the garden and returned with news of roses. The wise women, roused as gently as everyone else, arrived with the quick steps of people who have practiced calm for so long it runs on its own. The smallest of them stood on tiptoe to kiss Aurora's hand. "Not death," she reminded the air, which nodded, because the air had obeyed. Another checked the prince with a glance that measured kindness far more than lineage and found the measure good. The third looked out the window at the hedge and smiled to see it dignified and unafraid. They went to the great hall, where the table remembered how to receive. The head cook, who had fallen asleep halfway between recipe and instinct, returned to her instinct happily and sent for bread. Someone brought dawn bread from a pantry that had remained faithful. Butter met it like a friend returning from a long road, and honey brought summer to the table without arguing with the present. People ate not ravenously, but with reverence. Eating after a long rest is a kind of prayer. There was work to be done, but none of it was frantic. The steward crossed out the line in his book where he had written, "Long ago, oversights have consequences," and beneath it he wrote, "So does care." The captain of the guard went from post to post and discovered to his deep delight that every sword had stayed exactly where it should. The nurse from the nursery, older by no hour and wiser by a century, took Aurora's face in both her hands and said, "Oh, there you are," which is what the truest friends say. The prince asked for nothing more than a place to rinse travel from his hands, and a quiet corner at the queen's right hand at table. He was given both. He listened as people told small stories of what it was like to wake. The tailor who found his thread exactly where he had left it on his tongue. The gardener who finished pushing his trowel into earth and discovered the soil richer than he remembered. The bell ringer who took the rope and wept once, privately, at the way sound can be faithful. He learned the kingdom by listening. That is how one earns a place in any story worth keeping. Before the day was over, they climbed together to the tower room, not in dread, in respect. The wheel stood where it had stood. The spindle gleamed, no more and no less than good iron should. They did not smash it. They had learned the lesson in a higher dialect, that breaking what once hurt you does not guarantee safety. Understanding does. The king ordered the room kept as it was, door open, sunlight admitted, dust welcome to dance in it. "Let this be a museum for our children," he said, "so they know the shape of a danger gentled by love." Evening arrived, well-mannered and luminous. Lanterns found their hooks. Music found its way through old air and made itself at home. People drifted like contented rivers into a square that had waited with admirable patience. No proclamation commanded their joy. They simply stood within reach of one another and let relief turn to gratitude and gratitude into song. The first star came early and bright, as if in on the secret. The second followed like a friend who pretends not to hurry and does. Aurora and the prince walked the courtyard once more. They did not speak of futures as if they were lines already inked. They spoke of the day's small wonders, the taste of honey, the sound of bells relearning their duty, the way the roses had bowed and then stood tall. He told her of the road, the hill that looked like a sleeping ox, the creek that argued with stones and then agreed to go around them, the village where a child waved a hat so earnest the whole world seemed to laugh kindly. She told him of the cottage where dawn came through adoring windows, of a whistle that meant come home, of a tree with a scar like a doorway that listened well. "Do you fear tomorrow?" he asked. "Honest." "No," she said, honest. "I have had a long rehearsal in the art of waiting. Tomorrow is simply a short walk." They were quiet then, not out of shyness, but because silence, handled with care, is a good inheritance. Part 2. The wedding feast. The wedding was not made of spectacle. It was made of sense. The kingdom had slept and woken. Its first full day preferred meaning to display. Invitations traveled as quickly as joy could travel without spilling. They reached cottages that remembered lullabies and manor houses that remembered vows. They reached the charcoal burner with the back like a question mark, the mushroom woman with her basket of wise colors, the boy who knit nets and had taught himself not to startle at kindness. They reached the market's ribbon girl and the scholar with his deepened ink, and the baker with his perfect comma of flour at the lip of a bowl. The chapel wore both history and fresh flowers. The hedged roses arrived as themselves, thorns and all, arranged so that their ferocity guarded the aisle while their softness perfumed it. Light fell through the old glass and made a mosaic on the flagstones. Blues remembered from winter twilight, greens borrowed from river bends, golds generous as afternoon wheat. Musicians tuned, and the air thrummed as if a bee had decided to be a harp for a day. The queen walked in first, as if to test the path on behalf of everyone else. She had slept and woken into the world she had once only dared to hope for. Her face carried that knowledge with the quiet chin of those who have mourned and then been given back what they thought was lost beyond asking. The king followed, not martial, not grand, only entirely present. People bowed not to crown, but to the miracle of steadfastness. Aurora entered on her own feet. No one gave her away. Love is not a parcel. She wore a gown that remembered mornings, not palaces, linen that moved when air did, lace that looked like frost-writ ivy, a small sprig of rosemary at her wrist to remember courage, and a sprig of thyme to remember time. Her hair was braided with a ribbon, the color of a dusk she had once watched from the cottage threshold. She carried nothing but the expression of a person who intends to keep her promises. The prince waited at the front without pretending indifference and without performing eagerness. He had washed the road from his hands and then put it back in his heart. His coat was plain, his boots honest. The sword at his side knew it was not today's instrument. When he saw her, he did not look surprised, and he did not look smug. He looked home. Vows were spoken in voices that did not need to be large to be heard. The priest said little and mostly listened, which is an underrated skill. The words they chose were not complicated. I will keep you company. I will make room for your weather. I will tell you the truth in a way that lets the truth do its work. I will guard your rest. They each added one line that was wholly their own. She promised to notice when Joy arrived in small shoes. He promised to teach their house the sound of apologies offered on time. When they were finished, the room exhaled like a field after rain. The wise women approached, not to bestow new gifts, but to name those already present so that the naming could make them sturdier. You are patient, said one to Aurora, and patience is a bridge. You are attentive, said another to the prince, and attention is a lantern. The smallest laid her hand where their hands met. You are both tender, and tenderness is a craft. Practice it. It will make a harbor of your home. There was no sign of the uninvited guest. Absence can be a blessing when no harm is needed to teach humility. The hedge stood near the chapel door like a friend in a doorway, not coming in, not shutting out, simply witnessing with the dignity of old work completed to satisfaction. After the vows, the feast. The hall that had learned to breathe welcome plates and laughter, and the clatter that means living. It was not a test of gluttony. It was a rehearsal for gratitude. Bread reappeared, flaky and confident. Soups arrived in bowls made for two hands to carry, and carrying them felt like participating. Fruit tasted of fields, and rain kept at proper distance. Cheeses told jokes only cheeses know, and everyone laughed anyway. A child at the end of the table fell asleep with a pear still in her hand and woke later, delighted to find it there. The toasts were brief and true. The king raised a cup and spoke not of alliances won or borders held, but of fairness, how it had steadied them when fear would have made poor law. The queen spoke of waiting and how it is not empty if you fill it with care. The captain of the guard said 6 words that made every heart stand straighter. We slept, we woke, we keep watch. The head cook coaxed it to speak, lifted a wooden spoon as if it were a baton and said, "Eat while it's warm," which many declared the finest advice of the day. Music threaded among tables and then lifted people from benches without bossiness. Dances found feet. Elders showed steps remembered from festivals forgotten by calendars. Children made up steps that seemed right to their unarguable bodies. Aurora danced with the prince, and then with the queen, and then with the baker, who insisted she try a spin because Joy, for him, had learned a small whirl while the kingdom lay still. The prince danced with the nurse and apologized, even though she told him he had nothing to apologize for, which endeared him to everyone in earshot. Between dances, they walked the edges of the hall and let people speak to them one by one. The seamstress thanked Aurora for wearing lace that looked like actual frost and not an idea of frost. A farmer thanked the prince for the way he had greeted the hedge with an open hand and not a raised steel. The scholar brought the page he had finished at waking and said, "I made the sentence better," and they read it together and agreed he had. As evening leaned toward night, lanterns bloomed in trees. Musicians put away their instruments and took out their voices, singing old songs softly enough that the songs could keep their dignity. The stars approved by showing up in honest numbers. Someone brought out a long table of letters, new paper, new ink, and people wrote notes to their future selves. Remember this taste of bread. Remember how the bell found its note. Remember that patience returns what it owes in full. When the last song had the good manners to end, the prince and Aurora stepped outside. The hedge rustled, pleased to have witnessed a second ceremony that day, the first being vows, the second being 1,000 quiet acts of regard. They walked beneath a sky that recognized them. "Will we be happy?" he asked. "Because hope likes company." "Often," she said. "And when we are not, we will be faithful." They stood side by side and listened to the murmuring of a city putting itself to bed. Part 8, the forgotten telling, a softened shadow. In some older tellings, the story refuses to end at the wedding. It takes a path into a room where shadows keep careful accounts. We will go there, but with a candle, and we will speak quietly, and we will choose gentleness for the words that do not require sharpness to be true. After the feast, the prince, now a husband and soon a king, took Aurora to his own country. Roads learned their names by how thoughtfully their feet traveled them. The new court received her with lamps and windows and honest faces at doors. There were duties and letters and practice and rest. Love properly kept is also a schedule of small things. Bread at a certain hour, a walk even when the weather tries to be bossy. The habit of saying goodnight even on nights when worry would steal the word. In time, 2 children entered the rooms where Hope had taken a seat and waited politely. A daughter first, with a gaze like sunrise that made the palace corridors seem shorter. Then a son, solemn at birth and then immediately mischief, as if to demonstrate how quickly beginnings can surprise us. They learned to grasp fingers, to tolerate baths, to prefer stories with animal voices, to sleep best when the last thing they heard was their mother naming in order the things that would still be there in the morning. The chair, the window, the moon, if it chose, the door, the sound of father's boots in the corridor, the warmth that stays. But not everyone in the new palace had practiced patience during the years of sleep. The king's mother, queen in title, but uneasy in spirit, had grown a hunger that was not for food. Some tellings make her an ogress, and perhaps this is how a frightened heart looks from the outside. She loved power more than people, and fear more than fairness. She did not know how to share a son with joy. Jealousy is a misunderstanding of love's arithmetic. She had not yet learned its correct sum. When the king rode away to settle a border quarrel with wisdom instead of steel, the queen mother's house grew colder. She sent for the young queen and her children. The summons wore politeness like a thin cloak. Aurora, who had never confused courtesy with safety, went anyway, refusing fear its favorite game of making small things seem large by keeping them in the dark. What happened next is told in some versions with clatter and smoke. We will tell it with kitchen light and a door slightly ajar. The queen mother spoke sweetly and listened sharply. She asked to taste dishes fit for a royal appetite, and for reasons we will not put into a child's pocket, she named ingredients that included heartache. The palace cook, an old man with hands the shape of useful, stood in his quiet domain and looked at the order. He had sliced and stirred for kings who were kind and kings who were not. He had kept alive a small garden of herbs in a window where winter could not bully it. He made a decision. He took the children by the small, trustworthy wrists and led them through the back of the kitchen, where the pantry made its own weather. He placed them in the care of his wife, whose apron smelled like everything good, and he returned to his stove, where he prepared a meal that resembled the order only in shape. He served it with calm pages in his eyes. The queen mother ate and pretended she was satisfied. She was not. Hungers that practice are rarely fooled for long. She asked then for Aurora. Some tellings set roaring here. We will not. We will set a staircase. We will set a courtyard at noon. We will set the good cook, whose courage had begun as a small seed and was now, under pressure, a tree. He went to the queen and told her the whole truth with his hands open. She listened without flinching, because she had been a child who had faced a spindle and had learned that fear, named, loses its trickery. They planned. Cleverness joined kindness, and together they were enough. When the Queen Mother called, the answers came like quiet rain onto a roof, steady, unstartling, true. The children remain where bread is made and herbs are taught their names, which is to say, the safest room in any story. The Queen, summoned again, entered the hall with a calm that unbalanced cruelty. Bullies prefer echoes. Calm refuses to echo. It might have ended badly. Older versions try to teach this lesson with ash and smoke. But a messenger arrived from the king faster than despair could change its boots. He was ahead of his own dust, eyes bright with news. The border had been settled by forgiveness instead of victory, and he was almost home. There's a sound that malice makes when it hears that goodness is on the road. It is small. It is not important. It fades. The king entered the hall before anger could measure the distance between what it wanted and what it would get. He saw at once what had nearly happened, not in the arrangement of platters, but in the tilt of faces, the angle of shoulders, the particular silence that rooms keep when danger has tried to speak their language. He did not shout. He put his hand on the table as if to remind the wood that it was a table for fellowship and not for trial. "Mother," he said, "my house is for keeping, not for consuming." It was the gentlest sentence he ever spoke, and also the most immovable. Some say the Queen Mother left that day, pride tripping over itself and disappearing down a staircase that had never learned to love her steps. Some say she stayed and learned slowly that love does not divide a son from his joy. Our telling chooses mercy. She did not suddenly become kind. That is not how hearts learn. But she was given a room near a window and a chair with a view of the garden. The children brought her rosemary and thyme. She did not know what to do with either. The cook sent soup anyway. Aurora did not keep a tally. She kept a house. She and the king made of it a harbor and a school. They taught their table to welcome the tired and to encourage the brave. They raised their children on the arithmetic that jealousy never learns, that love multiplies when shared. The hedge beyond the city flourished, wild, fragrant, fully itself, and became a park where people walked to remember how patience looks when it grows leaves. Travelers visited and touched the thorns with respectful fingers and told their own children, "This is what guarded us when we could not guard ourselves." In the years that followed, there were harvests that apologized for previous mischief. There were winters that tested the virtues they had practiced. Fairness, watchfulness, humor, bread. There were days when the king and queen disagreed and then used the grammar they had promised to use. Truth said tenderly, apology offered on time, forgiveness made of more than ceremony. There were nights when the children demanded 3 stories and got 2 and learned, to their lasting benefit, that limits can also be love. When the king and queen grew old, they walked some evenings to the tower room and stood in its doorway, not to gloat at danger outlasted, not to rehearse an old fear, but to thank a room for having held a lesson without bitterness. "We were carried," Aurora would sometimes say, looking at the motes making small planets in the light. "And then," the king would answer, "we were taught to carry." Stories end, and they don't. They settle into the sentences people say when they think they are talking about other things. A baker, much later, would set a perfect loaf on a counter and murmur, "Not death, sleep," which was his way of saying, "Let it rest. It will be better for patience." A child, pressed by night to be afraid, would touch the window and tell the dark, "Please," and the night would oblige, opening a lane for one honest star. If you prefer the shortest version, it is this: a wish learned to walk, a curse learned manners, a kingdom slept and woke and did not waste the lesson. A girl and a boy agreed to hold a door for morning together. And whenever the story is told with care, it becomes again what it has always been at its best, a lullaby that remembers the world and believes in it anyway. Close your eyes. Let the roses keep watch. Let the bells, somewhere far and kind, stay ready to remember their note.